I made the decision early on myself. I was not going to comply with any aspect of this tyranny. And I've maintained that continuously, never given in thus far, and I don't plan to. I am a physician who has, I guess, gone rogue and questioned the narrative about the coronavirus. And I've been able to scrutinize the scientific experiments and reach a very different conclusion from the mainstream, that being which I strongly opine that there is no proof of a new virus or any new disease going on right now, and there's simply another agenda that's happening. And so that's made me somewhat of a controversial figure. And but it's important that the truth be known, because we need to be able to make the right decisions and be able to stand up against the tyranny that's been put up against us.
When I started looking into the information that was around at the very beginning on, let's say, the coronavirus, even though there's a reason why I don't really like calling it that, but I came across your work very early on when you started talking about exosomes. So I think that's probably a good place to start. Do you want to just describe how you came across the exosome theory?
Yeah, sure. Well, I really have to thank my friend Tom Cowan, who's another physician, and he was giving this lecture. It was like a closed webinar, but someone sent me a copy of it. It was almost like a bootleg version, right? Even though there's no copyright infringement, don't worry. But he mentioned exosomes in this talk when it was about the coronavirus, and he was sort of interpreting things from a Rudolf Steiner perspective. And when he said that word, something clicked, because earlier in my career, I had just read papers on exosomes. Actually, I think it was back in college, because I was doing a big project on gene therapy. And so I think it entered into that research, but it was a brand new field at the time. And when he said that in the lecture, it just clicked as being something of important. And I kind of had this experience where I thought that what they're showing under the microscope as saying it's a virus may actually be exosomes. And so for the next, like maybe 72 hours, I pretty much just feverishly researched and read papers on exosomes and viruses. And I was like a kind of a strange period, because I didn't sleep more than a few hours, each night. I remember getting out of bed at like 4 a.m. and coming down to the computer to look at papers, which is normally not, how I work. I'm pretty reasonable. But what I found was that everything I was reading confirmed that notion that I had, after being inspired by that word and Tom's words. And what I found was, because it was very confusing when I was reading the papers where they say that they have shown like a new virus to exist, they show these cell cultures and they're particles mixed in with the cells, and they just like have an arrow pointing to those and say that's the virus. But there's not any definitive way that they identify it. It's just, it looks like what they expect it to look like. And through the research, I found that exosomes actually look exactly the same. In every parameter that's visible under the microscope, they either overlap or are identical in appearance and physical parameters or physical properties. So I saw that they actually created an experimental condition to create exosomes, because in this cell culture, they're mixing in toxic materials like antibiotics. And there are other experiments that show antibiotics induce exosomes. And so I just basically said, how do you know that these are virus particles? Couldn't they be exosomes? And I researched this further, and it's a very interesting parallels between them, because I found in several papers, you have virologists, right, scientists who study viruses, actually make statements like the virusome and the exosome are the same thing. And so I thought this was really fascinating. And, you know, they may, some of them that I've quoted may have, you know, said that they don't agree with me, but this is their words that they wrote in the paper. You know, I didn't make that up. So they're the ones that drew the parallel between viruses and exosomes. And I only followed it up and examined the work that they and other scientists did. But here's some what exosomes are they're from our own cells, and basically it's an emergency signal. So if your part of your body is in crisis, like it's exposed to a toxic material or it doesn't get a nutrient and it can't function, and there are many, many things that can cause it, like exposure to radiation, you know, different kinds of illnesses like asthma even, can all cause cells to put out exosomes, and they basically pop these little particles out, and they have genetic material in them, just like they say viruses do, but they're supposed to send a signal to somewhere else in your body, like how do you manage the damage? So, you know, for example, let's say someone eats a poison mushroom and the cells in the stomach take it up and send out exosomes to the liver, telling the liver to make certain enzymes to break down the poisons in the mushroom, right? So it's kind of that kind of a system. And but with exosomes, interestingly, they can do the science fully. Like they can purify them out and show like a slide where all you see is exosomes. And they have a test tube which just has exosomes in it of one type, and they can actually sequence the genetic material because they could pull it right out of those exosomes and sequence it. And so the other thing you can learn from exosomes is that it gives you the experimental procedure to purify particles out of body fluids, which is what they're supposed to do to show that a virus exists. They could just simply take the body fluid where the virus is. So like if it causes pneumonia, right, like they say is in the case of COVID-19, they could simply take the lung fluid out of an infected person and then do this purification procedure to take the virus particles right out of that lung fluid. And they've done this with exosome experiments many times. And it's simple. They just use a centrifuge, basically, with a density gradient, which just spins it around and separates out the small particles. So if they did this experiment, they could definitely prove the existence of something. And they have the technology and the procedures because they've done it with the exosomes, but they don't do that ever with a virus because in the past, when they've tried it, they've never actually been able to show anything.
Are you saying that an exosome reaction is a cyclical reaction of the body to expel toxins? Is that what you're saying?
Well, so it's not necessarily to expel toxins because it's not like when an exosome comes out of a cell, it contains toxins in it that like it's removing from the cell. What it does is it contains information. So it's really a special message, like a telegram or something that has to be, you know, delivered physically. So that's what exosomes are mostly thought to do. Now, there have been some exosomes that have shown to take up toxins outside of the cell. So this was an interesting experiment where they had cells that were expressing exosomes, and they put in bacterial cells that had been, you know, like eating dead flesh. And so they were making a toxin called a bacterial endotoxin. And then they also mixed those bacteria with other cells that were not making exosomes. And the cells that were not making exosomes died. The cells that were making exosomes lived. And what they found was that the exosomes actually took up those endotoxins outside the cell in what they call the extracellular space. But that's the only experiment I'm aware of that's shown that exosomes are involved with removal of toxins. But there is the notion, like based upon Rudolf Steiner's work, that there are cellular excretions of cells that do remove toxins. So, but that doesn't necessarily match up with like laboratory studies that have been done. But that study I mentioned certainly shows that at least that particular type of exosome could take up toxins and remove them. And you could see how that could contribute to healing.
I must admit that what you were alluding to before about the photographs of exosomes that exist, I only stumbled across those photographs when I was looking for a photograph of a virus that had been isolated and purified, and all I could find was the pictures of the exosomes. Now, what that led me to deduce is that if it is relatively easy to produce a photographic representation of an exosome, why is it so difficult or impossible to produce a photographic image of a virus?
Well, I think the only realistic conclusion that one could come to, because it's not like this has only been tried for a couple of years. Like they've been trying to do this for 100 years, right? And especially since the 30s when the electron microscope was available. So it's not like there hasn't been attempts. I would say the only logical conclusion is that there are no such particles as viruses that invade the cells and cause disease.
I agree, and I think if Sherlock Holmes were a real character and were alive today, he would absolutely agree with you. Once you eliminate all realistic possibilities, even if the possibility that you're left with seems extreme, that almost always turns out to be the truth, unless you've overlooked something.
Right, absolutely. And when you have a theory that's proposed, right, you need to support that with empirical evidence. And if the evidence that you provide is not adequate or does not support the theory, then you can simply throw out the theory. There's no need to disprove it because it hasn't been proven. And if you really look at the dogmatic theory of viruses causing disease, you'll see that there's no underlying basis to support it. So you could really just toss it aside. Now, that doesn't tell you what the real explanation of disease is, of course, but that's a separate question. And one that should be answered more definitively, but I think already there's a lot of knowledge to explain that.
What do you think is the cause of disease?
Well, I think, first of all, that it's much more simple than the current prevailing wisdom would lead you to think, which basically says there's no explanation for many diseases. And the ones that we can't explain, we suspect there might be a virus causing them. I mean, that really is the case in virtually every illness that they feel is unexplainable, like autoimmune disease. There's research looking for viruses causing it. Just like the war on cancer in the 70s, a huge research program from the United States government was actually about finding viruses that cause cancer. It didn't support any other research. So this, there's been a lot of money and research put toward this paradigm. But what I find in my experience and in my research of experience of many, many other people is that illness is really caused by just a small number of things. It's caused by malnutrition of some sort, right? Deficiency in some particular nutrient. It's caused by excessive toxicity, which can come from many, many sources, from food, from the environment, from our own metabolism, certainly from things like vaccines and medical treatment, especially. And then psychological shock. And this is, a severe psychological kind of trauma or stressor. Psychological shock, I take that term from German New Medicine. But it's very important, and it by itself can cause disease, and often it's a combination of any of those above factors that I mentioned, because they all influence each other directly and indirectly. And when I say exposure to toxins, I'm also including things like radiation and EMF exposure in that category, so as not to leave anything out, because those things can certainly cause illness. And then, I go back and then there's physical trauma. Okay, so like something physically disrupts the integrity of your body. That certainly is another cause of illness. That's pretty obvious to everyone. And then the last category I kind of go back and forth about, because there may be some truth to it, but it can actually almost always be rectified through lifestyle changes, and which is genetic-based illnesses.
Mm. I was actually going to ask you if you knew about German new medicine.